guess we'll call to order our April 2nd, 2018 Finance Committee meeting. And we have two board members. Obviously, they're absent for various reasons, and we did meet in executive session before the meeting. So Chuck or Regina, I don't know if you guys are going to start with the presentation. While they're bringing that up too for the board members, especially those that, this is kind of like your first go around with these. I mean, this is an open discussion in a board meeting. So, as Chuck and Regina are working through these issues, there is no reason why you can't ask questions at any point if you want clarity on anything. So, I mean, this is a very, very open meeting, a little less formal than our traditional voting and board session. So they are more than willing to answer any questions that any of us have during the course of the meeting at any time. So thank you.
Good point, Phil. And, please stop and ask us questions. We have a budget presentation. It's a few slides. It's a lot of slides you've seen before, updated a little bit. We have provided you with a bunch of documents in detail mode for you, so you can look at it as you requested. Also have a thing in there if you want to go over it, or if you don't, on the one-to-one, it's in there for you, kind of an update. We'll get you some cost on the one-to-one, what has happened over the past 3 years, but basically the one-to-one presentation that Stephen had put together is really kind of a follow-up of what was done a couple months ago. And as we've done phase 3 of the one-to-one already. The iPads have been purchased for the 18-19 year, so they can get prepared and ready for the students and the teachers. Teachers, I believe, already have them in their hands. If not, they're getting them this week. Maybe they got them before break. So that's what that.
I think as we were talking about the one-to-one too, if you recall at the budget presentation, we had talked about cost savings and what could we do minimally, and the decision was made to delay the 4th grade, which won't impact our overall implementation of the Canvas, the learning management system, but the devices, so you'll see that on the new revised timeframe. The purchase of those iPads for 4th grade, the devices per student for them to take home, we delayed that for a year. So the new timeline is there too, and we'll get to that.
Can I ask a quick question just about the devices? And there was some news recently that Apple came out with a more cost-effective device. Does that impact our decision at all? Like, would we switch or keep everything uniform, or?
And that's we'll have the gift of time to discuss with our elementary students, 4th and below, and that's something that Steve will continually look at with his team. But it will give us that opportunity to look at the level of device for the 4th, then 3rd and 2nd, then 1st and kindergarten in that iterative process. But as we'll see moving forward when we talk about the budget, the cost of the devices themselves have gone down, which is not unusual. But of course, when you budget, you can't predict that they'll come down. You have to budget what the price is. So the cost is less.
And as Steve and I looked at we did look at that, and as we compare what the announced price was, when you add on, we do purchase the Apple Care. It comes up to pretty close to what we were paying for anyway. The Apple Care is so that the students are protected for at least 3 of the 4 years that they have the device. The 4th year, we're kind of on our own, which is why we have that tech fee that we collect from them yearly, so that we have a fund to pay for that.
Do we do something like analyze how many times we utilize Apple Care to make sure that it makes sense to carry that insurance?
Yes.
And right now okay, as long as we're doing that and we're making sure, because we're already providing really good cases, and I didn't know if we were overprotected.
One of our techs who happens to be here tonight, Matt in the back room, he probably didn't want me to say his name because he's back there. He's actually our Apple guy, Apple expert, and he's been pulling in a lot more of the Apple repairs on his own. So we've been evaluating as to whether long-term we would stay fully with Apple Care. So we have to do an evaluation of that.
Yeah, because with the cost of the devices dropping so much, I'm wondering if it makes sense. But I'm glad it's in professional, good hands.
Awesome. Good job, Matt. So we'll go over the, what's that?
I like Matt's phone number because I have lots of Apple devices.
No. We're going to go over the projections. We'll go over the healthcare trend, the state budget, and we will look at the reserves. Here's the projections for this as of the end of March. Actually, as of a week before the end of March, but that. So we're anticipating that the revenues are going to be a little bit higher than we budgeted, not as much as last year, because while we're seeing still a high level of transfers and interims, not as high as last year. Most of that is going to be from interims. We're actually going to come in probably less than last year for the transfer taxes, mainly because there's hasn't been any real large sales of commercial properties. And the expenditures, you can see we have kind of whittled it down to just barely under our budget. We were a little concerned with that because of the extra positions we had in the budget this year, but through a spending stop that the superintendent we put on mid-year, and we actually didn't fully stop hiring, but we have selectively not hired some replacements for people that are leaving. Not teachers, so it's not a real big impact item, but we're dealing with, or we are moving some of the support positions to the contracted position as we can when they leave.
So what you just said, do you mean that when the teacher leaves, we're moving some of the support staff that are not covered under the bargaining agreement to cover certain things?
No, when a support staff leaves, we're either not replacing them right now and divvying out the duties, so if it's a 3-hour aide, maybe 2 other aides get an hour, and we've been trying to reduce things like that, or we reduce them altogether if we can. And we've been focusing a lot on trying to corral the costs, especially of the personal care aides.
Right,
Quite frankly, as they roll out, we're either not replacing them at all, or if we have to put some instructional support in for the special ed classrooms, which we lack, we're doing that.
Got it. Thank you.
And there are some areas that are just doing without for the remainder of this year until we fall into the budget next year. And we did not do any snow plowing today, so I'm happy to say, because we've had a pretty bad year in snow removal, because it seems like it's the worst time, and it was always salting and pushing, and the last time was heavy, and we'll probably give an update at the facilities meeting. Jim will give an update on what we've spent so far next week. This is the healthcare costs. In 2010, we went down the road of self-funding healthcare along with everybody else in the county. And you can see the first 6 years did pretty well, about level. 14, 15, the plan design changed a little bit, so that did help some. And it helped maintain the cost. Last year, we had a budget that the healthcare costs went up, as you can see, 22.5%. Going into that year, we were told we were going to have 0 or maybe even a little less. Did not happen. Healthcare costs are very volatile. As you know, we had 13 high claims last year. Those would be 13 claims in excess of $100,000 each. And a couple of those claims were actually into the 7 figures. So last year, we had projected and actually had budgeted not a lot and ended up with a big increase. This year, the increase started out the first 6 months looking like it was going to mimic last year. Now, we are going to still have an increase over last year, but I'll remind you that that's an increase over a year that was 22.5%. So we're not down to the, by any means, down to the level of the 15, 16. And next year, the projection from the consultants is to run about 14, little less than 15%.
Chuck, is this just health insurance, or is this health insurance and prescription?
That's just health insurance. This is a different look at it, and actually I should put the percentages on here because our numbers that are being covered are actually going down a little bit too, as some of the teachers that retired that were covered under healthcare are dropping off of the healthcare because their years or whatever are going. But it shows the per employee per month cost that we spend, and you can see how this is just a 5-year projection or 5-year historical. It's this year's year to date, so that's only with 9 months or actually with 8 months of data. It's through the end of February.
And Chuck, these numbers here include family members as well, so it's not just the employee, but those employees that have a
Right.
family on the plan. These numbers are averaged out to
Yeah, it's the
include all
total
those that are
cost
insured.
divided by
Total loss, okay.
divided by the total number of employees we have covered. So it's single employees, and then it's employees with 4 kids. So this chart shows our reserves over the past 6 years and the budget for the ending budget we think we'll have for this year. We have gone down in reserves since 14, 15. I'll show you on the next slide, and also underneath there shows what our designations were for. Most of the designations, PSERS is our pension plan. OPEB are the other post-employment benefits. That's the teachers and things that get health care and get their sick leave accrual and things that the Government Accounting Standards Board required that we have a reservation for in their statement number 34 about 8 or 9 years ago. We still have that little Devereaux plug in there, and then the other is budget, and that's the amount that we designate to the subsequent year's budget. The next slide just shows the total reserves and the projection, and you can see what the total reserves are. And you can see in the 12-13 year, we had a pretty big bump. I will explain that one. That's the year
The unwinding of the spot.
No, it was the year that the administration recommended that the budget be at the index. Some of the board wanted 0, and some of the board wanted the index plus the exceptions, and it was 5-4. We got the exceptions, so we ended up with a lot extra reserves because we did not have those budgeted, and really it got us to a point nowhere near what some of the other schools have. Our budget and our reserves are adequate and are actually, according to Moody's and all, one of the reasons why we get our AAA bond rating. This is a chart that shows the capital project reserves or capital reserve fund. And you can see it's kind of got we added a trend line there. You can see it's continually decreasing. Actually, this year, we will be down to 2.5 million or less. I would never recommend it going much less than that, because if we have an issue, something even bigger than the sinkhole, you would have no place to go for it. This is why you have this. And we do some of the projects out of there, but now, because there's no money in there to just budget out of there, we are actually budgeting in the general fund to pay for the projects. and budgeting in the general fund to pay for the one-to-one technology and the technology stuff. So the general fund is budgeting that. And many years ago, somebody on the school board said, we ought to just budget for what we need. So as of this budget, we now are budgeting. We're budgeting the capital fund in the general fund as a transfer, but it is the budget. It's actually a little less than what the budget is, but not much. And we kept the technology for the one-to-one and all in the general fund. I will add that the bar in 2014 and 15, that spikes. For the board members that were here then, that's when we did the $10 million bond issue. We looked at, we were going to do a refinancing. And at the time, the board decided to just we kept the debt service the same and borrowed the money and put that in the fund, or we would have been out of money talking about this 3 years ago. So that's why there was a spike that year. And this is the plan for the use of the reserves. This is the final year. We will have no more pension reserves. Pension reserves were started back in 2000 and, I kept it on the chart. It's the year Rendell said we were going to have X for a pension number. And then, of course, as you know, the state budget is always adopted after our budget's done. And they ended up, instead of it being, I can get you the exact number if you want. Instead of it being like 12%, it ended up being 8%. So there was a significant amount of money that was budgeted left over in the fund. This is 2011 or 12, which was then used to establish his pension reserve, which we've kind of stretched out for as many years as we could.
So what will that mean for us in the future?
We will have no pension reserve. Next year, there won't be the 2.1 million and 1.5 million from pension. It'll be 2 or whatever we have. The next slide just shows you what we're getting from the governor's budget. $47,000 total, additional new money, not counting the pension money, which they pay us. It's a formula-driven money, not counting the Social Security money. They are formula-driven money. This is their money designated for basic funding and special ed funding. We get just under $1.5 million in our special ed funding. We do qualify for some contingency funds, which Joanna has applied for and we've gotten, which is why the budget isn't exactly that. It's a little bit higher because we anticipate that, but some years we get what we think we're going to get, and some years we get less.
I think just to further explain that, if you remember, that's what Joanna talked about. If specific children, the cost of educating them exceeds a high range, the state, we apply for that and the state will reimburse us a percentage of that overage. So it's not a lot of money, but it helps for really high cost cases.
Chuck, how does this compare to what we got last year?
It's about the same.
So our enrollment in that disaggregate group has gotten larger and our contribution remains the same?
Correct. That's
The inequity? Thank you.
I mean, many years ago, the special ed funding formula was in a, what they call excess cost formula. So there was a pretty complex formula. It got us a lot more money, where you would calculate the excess cost over and above what it costs for a regular ed student, and you were purely reimbursed at that. But that was back in the 80s, and back in the late 80s, they changed it because the state needed money for something else, so they decided to kind of worked out a formula to which got us virtually nothing. Well, I think we're the lowest in the county in special ed funding, at least based on that. And we're pretty low in regular ed funding also. We've always been what they call a hold harmless, where they would stop us at a certain number, but not let us get anything less and give us a minimum increase. They do have a funding formula in place now, which is generating things based on more actual numbers, but we will probably not get any of those numbers because it's really based on a lot of your demographic population and really geared toward schools that have an aid ratio in excess of probably 0.6 or 0.7, which there is nobody in our area, in our county that is even that high, I don't think. Maybe Octorara, but it's, most of our aid ratio is 0.15 for things like this. It's 0.1 and when you carve out some of the or personal income. The variables here, the economy is always a variable. Just goes unsaid. Teacher contract is a variable. We have no clue what teacher's contract will be. We have a budgeted amount of money in there for staying within your parameters.
Chuck, looking at these numbers here, I mean, and, you know, some of us have been here for some time. It appears to me that it's finally leveled out. Are these numbers legitimate in the sense that these are pretty locked in stone? I mean, from the standpoint of your estimation, when you go to your various meetings, I mean, 34, 35% in the out years, is that a reasonable expectation that that's what the number's going to be, or is it just year to year as per usual?
Well, I mean, it's year to year as usual, although the fluctuation hasn't been the same. For example, in 2016-17, the number we had to budget for before December of 2015 was 29.27%. It came in at 30.03. Not a big amount of money, but, you know, on our teacher's contract, let's say, that's $250,000. The 2017-18, this current year's number was the budget number the actuaries had given for the pension plan was 30.03%, and they came in at 32.57. So it was about 2.5%, which is even more.
Yeah, just roughly, can you kind of lay some numbers on those for us too? These percentages, you know, they obviously make sense, but can you put a number on that? Basically, how you get there, is it 7,000 or 7 million, 8 million, 10 million? What is the actual number as opposed to the percentage? You don't have to be exact. You can estimate, just not front-end estimation.
Well, this year's number is just south of, I'll get you the number. So this year's just under 14 million, or for the 18-19 budget, it's just under 14 million. This current year, it's like 13.3 million, give or take. And when you go backwards in time. I had that on a chart for you before. I was looking for that actual chart.
I guess the point is, then we move forward in time, you're looking at increases of hundreds of thousands of dollars, not to the degree of millions like we have done in the past, correct?
Yeah, this year is the first year we're probably less than $1 million increase in pension. I mean, that sounds awful, but you know, if you look at the gap between just the 4 years between 12-13, that's up there, and 16-17, that was pretty significant increases that happened. And I kind of have later on here, I have a review of the same chart there that, I'll get to that in a second, where it shows how the pension really is kind of skyrocketing. This was the variable thing. I guess I have this in here. So state budget, again, we never know the state budget till after the state budget's done. We're told the state budget will be done early this year because it's an election year, but we'll see.
Like the last election year, how it was
Yeah, yeah, they're all, it's like that. Special ed is another unknown. And I hesitate to say this, we did have our pre-bid meeting for the RFP I call it a pre-bid, pre-RFP meeting for the personal care assistants and instructional aides, because and we had 18 people there from 10 companies, which was roughly twice what I thought would be there. So the good news is there's some hunger for people to come in for the business, and I'm hoping that relates to a significant percentage decrease from that $3 million budget we have for that. So we'll see. And
Chuck,
then-
could I just, about the aides, so there's 18 vendors, and we've been using Crest. I know CCIU uses Crest, and I also understand that it's really not all about money, although it is largely about money.
It's
Do
all
you-
about money.
Do you have any, have you gotten, and this really, but I think it is pertinent to my thought process, but is there a slide? Do they go from a certain, are they closely priced, their hourly rates? Or is there a large slide?
We'll tell you next week.
Okay,
Because
Fair
we have our bid opening on Thursday this week, so, or RFP opening Thursday this week. Based on the stuff, the superintendent did a little survey with our superintendent friends, and my answer would be no. There's a big gap between first and second place.
And there is, if nothing else, we've created a lot of conversation around the competition to become more competitive where pricing is concerned. And the RFP was very well written to allow us to get what we need rather than pay for possibly a higher level of service than is necessary. So it's been a really good process.
It has. I mean, for example, 6 years ago or 7 years ago, you could get people with college degrees. They were, I hate to say it, but they were like a dime a dozen because there was a lot of teachers not getting jobs and they wanted to get into school any way they could, so they took these jobs. So there was a creation of a level of requirement of having a college degree to have one of these jobs. That's not necessarily true. We don't necessarily need that. I mean, some of the ones without college degrees are just as compassionate and good with the kids as the ones with them. So, so we've kind of made that a little bit of a, that was one of the questions actually at the pre-RFP meeting.
And really what we'd prefer to do is train our own.
Right.
Once we have a cadre of folks, train them to what we want rather than selecting a higher priced vendor need. So it's been a good process and I think it'll serve us well.
So here's the budget again. Some of these numbers have changed a little bit. I have to kind of fess up that as we drilled down and kind of put things where they should, some things were being captured in the wrong area. The total is the same. Salaries, there's a category called game workers, which kind of is only a small category, but it kind of made it jump from now, instead of 600, was rounded to 700,000 for salaries. So that's why salaries are up a little bit. Here, look, benefits, special ed, no big surprises there. The other schools are still kind of large. And as I said, with other financing, we've truly gone to a model now where you are budgeting in your general fund, a transfer that covers the budget for the capital fund. That was a recommendation from many years ago from the board. And we've pulled the technology into the general fund. So there's now very little in the capital fund. I wouldn't want it to get much lower than that because you have no reserve for emergencies. And we could have one pop up. So this was just to show you that the difference in the special ed. Remember we tried to tell you a little bit about the story of the difference between us and some other people. Our special ed costs are going up higher than Unionville and TE. We can see that. I mean, we do have other schools in the county that have as many kids as us. I mean, if you want to compare us to Coatesville and those kind of schools, that's fine. But this was just to kind of remind you of that. And these are our special ed numbers. What we've had over the past few years and what we're projecting for this year. And the budget has got to reflect at least the projection for this year and a little bit more. We're hoping that maybe it can be adjusted a little bit based on this RFP, but this RFP would truly be a couple $100,000 savings, which I'm not making fun of a couple $100,000 savings, but in the realm of a $18 million line item or function area, it will kind of soften it a little bit. Here was the swing of pension expense, and everybody sees this pension expense, and you can see over the past 10 years how it's going up pretty dramatically for us. It should level out, as Phil said, it should. And then just as a reminder, some of the other costs from the intermediate unit that are going up for us. And these are what we budget. You saw these last week, so I won't belabor them. The budget is still at $105,700,000, and the revenue sources have been adjusted somewhat. As we bring things more up to speed, we've included all of the assessments. We've gotten most of the reverse assessments in. And a lot of our increase in assessed value is coming from those reverse assessments over the past couple of years. So we've had an increase in assessed value, but a majority of the increase is coming from the reverse appeals of the commercial properties we've done. So we have a budget gap of about 1.9 million. We're about 60,000 short, which is, we're right about right on it. That's, I wouldn't call that a gap that you would worry about. And then you want to talk about staffing?
Again, the staffing, and this is what we had spoken about before, the 4% decrease, and this is not through furloughs. It is, we're looking at, as we always do, and as I've had an opportunity to share, looking at how we can increase efficiencies with maintaining the quality of delivery of services. So we're looking through retirements, and we have a number of co-teaching partnerships that we're looking at how we can redeploy some of our professional staff to absorb that, the programs. The elementary, we're looking at no change, no net change. With the redistricting, we will have many of our, we will be moving some teachers, but the net we're expecting to be 0. So that doesn't mean there's no change in teacher assignments at the elementary level. It simply means that we're hoping we won't have to hire additional staff to cover the change in enrollments. Special education, this is what we had spoken about, a psychologist, and we're looking at having a psychologist oversee, like a coordinator of psychology, so we could do the child study teams that Dr. Wexler had spoken about, the pre-referral process, with the goal of putting interventions in place prior to a child becoming identified, as well as assisting with the evaluations. The elementary autistic support class, that is going back to what we had last year. We were able to take the elementary autistic support class and make it an itinerant level of support across the district. With our new enrollments, we are having a number of students come to us from early intervention, which is the kindergarten program, going into the kindergarten program. So the age gap requires us to have an elementary autistic support class because the span would be too great in age. And our speech and language. As we had spoken about, our numbers of students receiving speech and language services through an IEP warrant an additional therapist. In teaching and learning, we're talking about an English language development coordinator. That's for our ELL population, and we will also be using that position to oversee the summer programming of ELL. We pay, right now, a contracted level of provision for that summer ELL camp. We'd have this position oversee that, so that would absorb some of the cost of that position as well. So the estimated total would be 0 positions increased, and the elementary would be budgeted as, at the same as the 17-18 school year.
And just for the purposes of whatever, the ELL is all mandated services, and they're all mandated at certain levels in the classrooms and all that kind of stuff. You can't just decide that you want to have slightly larger classrooms of ELL kids, because that's all mandated on
And actually, the
the ratios.
English language provision isn't on classrooms, because those students are included in classrooms. It's number of contacts per week based, it's a little bit complicated, but it's based upon the WIDO, which is the assessment that's given, and students are identified at what level of English language proficiency they are. And based upon that level, they require, it's mandated that they receive a number of contacts per cycle. So,
Caseloads then that I'm
yes, you're thinking of the caseload of the coordinate, of
The
the,
person who's doing it can't have those caseloads are mandated then? Or
Well,
so there's
it-
some issue in there that you
Exactly.
can't have like 70 kids on one person's caseload, because then they can't.
well, it's a number of contacts per
Meet
week,
the
and there's only
contacts
so
that
many
they
hours
can-
in a day, right?
Okay.
So that's where all that comes in.
And the other thing with the psychologist, the idea there is, even though it might be a 1-year increase, that the idea is that overall, as we move through the years, that will help to not to decrease to students who need services, but to try to get students before they need services so that they won't need services.
Absolutely.
That's the idea with this, is that it's a cost avoidance for the future, as opposed to just trying to meet a need now and not looking down the road.
Right. The more we can strengthen the universal instructional design for all students and put interventions in place, the idea is less students would require that intensive level of support moving through the system. So that's the goal.
And this has worked at other districts. This is part of the reason why we're looking at this, right? This isn't a program that we're looking to pilot. This is something that other people have done and said, hey, this works well.
Well, this is a national model.
That's what I've
Yes.
said. This isn't just Bright Valley saying, we think this will work. This is something that other people
And
have.
actually, from 1990 to 1995, it was mandated that there was an instructional support system at every school. And it was one of those unfunded mandates that have stayed around. Many districts have held on to that pre-referral process. Others haven't. We've spent the last 1.5 to 2 years building the model. You just need somebody to make sure they're coordinating the implementation of those interventions. And that's what this person would do, as well as doing evaluations.
Just class size, you want to talk about that, or you?
These are the guidelines, and this is per the policy, and we had much discussion about this, and I just wanted to clarify. There was a question that was asked about if the class size guidelines changed, and it's more complicated than, because it depends where the students go. What grade, for example, how will enrollment impact our class size? One of the things that, as we're meeting with each building to talk about the budget, to remind everyone that these are guidelines, they're not caps or maximums. So it's a guideline of best practice based on level and research. It's not saying that you can't go over that maximum or under that, the lower end of the guideline. So just to reiterate that. And we monitor those to keep us in the ballpark. So when we do scheduling, it's a little more difficult at the high school, because as you're doing scheduling, there are a lot of variables that impact changes of classes and sections. For example, we had a number of, as parents came and spoke at board meetings, there were some students who were put into certain classes. And I think we had 6, if I'm not mistaken, students that were put into a certain level of math, for example. And then over the summer decided to take a course that would allow them to matriculate through our math courses more quickly. So they took a course outside of the district that we transferred the credit, but we didn't teach the course. There was no way of knowing that. So then those students that were scheduled, say, for geometry, then bounced to Algebra 2 or another level of math, and it created a void. So although the schedule was set to have those classes within the range, when those students no longer needed that class, it deflated that enrollment. So there was a lot of change. There are a lot more changes and flexibility at the high school than there are in elementary. Of course, it's homerooms or classes. Middle school, it's teams, and they're a little less flexible, but the high school, it goes by periods, so there's a lot of flexibility. So we receive monthly reports of class sizes per class at the high school, and there's a lot of flexibility there with students dropping, adding, changing levels, et cetera.
I understand this is not a cap, and we've had, some kind of spirited discussions around this, but do our neighboring school districts have similar policies? Like, how do we line up with the same issue in other districts, particularly those we're compared to? Do they have the same numbers, different numbers, no policy?
There are many schools that don't have a policy around class size. So they have a philosophy around class size, but not so much that they would have, it as defined as we do per policy. And that's why one of the things that I wanted, especially when I meet with the teachers, to help understand that it's a guideline, and it's really, we have to be really careful not to think there's any magic in, if you go over by one, that there's a detriment to children. Because that is not, the science is not that specific. Because you can quite honestly have 22 students, and depending upon the makeup and the dynamic of that class, you can add 3 or 4 more without impact. Where the opposite could also be true, depending upon the dynamic of the class. So there's no magic in that. It's just, obviously, the younger children, the more individualized attention, and that's why the numbers are lower typically at the earlier ages.
So I have a follow-up question. I think that's an important question. So if neighboring school districts don't necessarily have a guideline, they have a philosophy, how do our average numbers compare to them? Like, how do our average class size compare to TEs, let's say? You can't tell me every class, I know, but just sort of in general, is it similar? Is it dissimilar?
What I've been told is their classes are larger. What I've been told by administration is they're in line with us.
Okay.
So there is also some districts are less willing to share information. So I know Dr. O'Toole and Mrs. Beck have done a lot of inquiring as far as best practices, especially in districts that we're very frequently compared to. And the one thing that is positive, they've asked to come to many of our classes, and they have had they're hoping to learn from the things we're doing in Great Valley. So that's always a benefit. We haven't had as much success in getting information reciprocated, but we'll keep trying.
So
Just for the record, before we move on too, I think looking at these numbers here, we had a very few intense meetings with regard to adjusting and moving students around because of Atwater. I see these numbers here, and we talk about the overall number of students in the school district, but I know that we work on projections and understanding how many kids are coming, and I can appreciate the fact that you don't know where all those kids are falling from the standpoint of the pockets in the school. But is there a way now that you can kind of estimate, knowing what families are moving in, the students and the children that they have, where they're going to fall as it relates to populating the various classes in the school district? And if you don't know now, when does that number come in where you can kind of more definitively pinpoint it and say, this is the number? We know we have, eight new elementary school kids going into first grade in General Wayne, for example. Like, when does that number become real as opposed to just, we know there is a pocket of kids out there?
We get the number, and I can tell you, we're feeling more and more confident with Atwater numbers now than we were last summer, because what we were told was very deflated than the reality. So we get projections, and it's all based upon what kind of units and the likelihood of, if it's a townhome, this many families, if it's apartment complexes, this many families. And that's what we're getting when we're meeting with the Planning Commission representatives. The issue is, we don't know what grade levels they're going to until they enroll. So to tell us we're getting 15 elementary students in General Wayne tells us we're getting 15 elementary students, but it doesn't tell us which grade levels they're going to. So that seems as though it's not as important until we're doing the enrollment up to the day. So as you saw parents coming to the board meeting to speak and saying, in fourth grade in this building, it's a problem.
Yeah.
In fourth grade in another building, it wasn't a problem. So, and that wasn't developments, that was just turnover of properties. So we've been really working with them to say, if there's a lot of sales and buying, or a lot of houses for sale in certain areas that aren't development driven, they've been sharing that information with us as well. So if it's a single family home, and it appears as though it's a larger home and a young family moving in, that communication has been helpful to us, not only for this information, but also for us to do the reach out, so we get the information sooner rather than later, to reach out to those families, and if they are, to get them to meet with Dale Garrison and start the enrollment process, so they're not waiting until August 24th to do so.
And realistically speaking, I can appreciate people, there's no fixed time when they move. But there has to be times, like, maybe after the first of the year, in the summertime leading up to when school starts, to have a better sense as to who's coming and where they're going.
And the reality here is we have a policy in place that students can enroll in our schools if they're moving into the district within 90 days. So what happens for a development, they may be told by the developer that they'll be in their house by October 15th. So for educational continuity, they'll have their child start school at the beginning of the year, and then they'll come in and meet with us and let us know that they're not going to be in their house until potentially November 1st. But that kind of thing helps us be a little more planful. So we're not getting all these people coming in November 1st, because moving into homes, as you said, is not necessarily based upon the school year. It's much more fluid. So that helps us in a sense, but it also requires us to pay attention to those folks who tell us they're going to be in their homes by November 1st. And we all know with buildings, sometimes the best made plans are just, the calendar doesn't cooperate.
So then, Regina, the information that we're getting from the townships is really just based on the potential number of units that will be occupied someday, some way by somebody. So basically, you guys get the information that, okay, we're going to put another 100 units in Atwater, and because they're 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom, 2-bath, you take a look at it and you use your best guess that, okay, that unit is going to be finished in 2 months, and people could move in that might have a first grader to a 12th grader.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the realities has just happened at the last township meeting. What the developer proposes, they make changes, and those changes can have significant impacts. So to say it's going to be 20 units and then change it to 50 units has a significant impact on what we see. So having those meetings more regularly has been really helpful. And they've been, the township supervisors have been very communicative with us, but they go also by feasibility studies and impact studies that they receive, which, as we know with Atwater and with others, it tends to be lower than the reality.
And I think part of the reason why we wanted to talk more about that in facilities was to try to see what we can see as we move through this historically, to see if we can figure out, hey, typically if it's a single-family house, we're going to get more kids than we are if it's a unit full of apartments. And if it's townhouses, it's going to kind of be so that we're kind of regularly looking at those numbers as much as we possibly can, so that if we get another huge unit, then we can bring it back faster to say, hey, we think this is potentially going to impact us.
Right, we also talked about percentage over the percentage over the predicted.
What
So
the
if we
initial,
look-
yeah, so that if
Exactly.
they're saying, hey, it's going to be 50 houses, and it ends up being 400 houses, that we kind of take a look at that too, to say, hey, we can't let this lie fallow because this is,
Right, so they've been working with us to say, okay, we had the Malvern Hunt experience, how many over was that? We had the Atwater experience, how many over was that? So then we can say, okay, it's a percentage over, so when we are given the impact study, we can say, okay, they estimated this many students coming, let's add this percentage over, so we're a little closer to the reality. Again, it's
it's not going to
a
help those
guesstimate.
individual grade levels, but it might help us avoid having to redistrict maybe a school after students are already enrolled. I think that was part of our primary goal in looking at that, was that there's no way to know those 15 mythical kids that we're talking about now, whether or not they're all going to fall in third grade or whether they're going to be spread out across the building and so have less of an impact. But I think the idea that we know that they're coming at all is something that definitely helps.
Yeah, I think the concern is them moving in, the impact it has on the number of additional employees that need to be hired to sustain that. So I guess if no one has any other questions, we can move on to the next slide. I think, Chuck, it looks like you've got the millage slide up there, unless you're going to jump over it.
Same as 2 weeks ago. We have a look at our 5-year picture. There's 2 looks at it. One assumes no tax increases, so this one would be if you didn't have any tax increases and just chose to blow through your entire reserves, which would violate GASB 34, but that's okay. You can do that. It's not a jailable fine.
Well, let me ask you a question here too, because I mean, this is an issue where, we've talked about coming off of the debt service. It's a very large chunk of money. Obviously, it's been repurposed to pay for a significant portion of the new roof. Next
Well, it's
year,
the building projects. I
Right.
mean, we have,
Right.
if you see the facilities committee, we have building projects that exceed that roofing
yeah.
number for the
yeah, but
next.
my point is this, next year, I mean, the money that's come in has been spent, or, whatever's happened has obviously been spent. Next year, the money's not been spent.
Oh, no, it's already earmarked, and we're hoping that it doesn't blow up ahead of where it's earmarked. I mean, we have a good $3 million, $3.5 million per year earmarked for at least the next 5 years to catch up on HVAC projects. And not only that high school roof, there's a lot of capital projects that we've been deferring, and some of them are failing now. And so we're kind of hoping that we can get to the outlying years where we said we want to replace them. But like, for instance, those HVAC units at Katie Markley that are incredibly outdated, we have to buy recycled, it's not Freon, but the recycled stuff for those units. Because they don't even make them anymore, and they're starting to fail, and as they fail, they have to be replaced with something else. So we've kind of pushed those in the outlying years so that we don't go below that $2.5 million in capital, but the capital for the next 5 years is pretty pegged at, we're gonna spend what we have, and that's not anticipating massive other projects like some of what we've had with this water main and some of these other big projects that were.
Because the simple question was here is that money is not, it's reflected as being spent in the upcoming years. That's what you're showing up there, Chuck, with those numbers?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And you have a copy, I pulled it from the facilities meeting, the 5-year plan. Yeah. So you have a copy in there for you of that 5-year facilities budget that was you had available through the facilities committee from the last time we met. So I put that in there for you too. So based on this slide, you would be negative in 2021. And I'll tell you, I made some pretty good. I have the assumptions up there for the expenditures, but also assumed a 2.5% increase in the assessments, which would be high if we run out of reverse appeals or if we start going the other way with some of the appeals. So, and that assumes that we continue building at the same, they continue building at the same way. I'll add a little bit onto the Atwater thing a little bit. The biggest problem with Atwater was that, not that we knew how many units they were going to have, but they built them so fast because there was such a high demand they actually scaled up to build faster. I mean, like twice as fast. We should have had half the number of students. We still would have been doing the same thing we were doing, but it would have affected half as many people that were already in the building. Instead of affecting 100 or 80, whatever it was, it might have affected 35 or 40. But township manager said they just can't stop building them because they just keep selling them.
Chuck, you raised an interesting point too. In years past, we have seen where you've got the landowners filing a significant amount of appeals, and that drives down the revenue. And it seems to me, I mean, we're on this trend where fair market values have gone up. We're doing these reverse appeals. Are you seeing a significant tail off of the landowner filing the appeals?
No, we still
It's
have
still the
those.
same number. Okay.
Our reverse appeals have been keeping them at even and then some. So most of the appeals, we had a large number of commercial appeals. We lost a large number of commercial appeals this year. I didn't detail them because Liberty Properly decommissioned a bunch of their buildings. I mean, that was big. You know, the corner there where they're going to build another Worthington kind of site across from the new Wawa by the slip ramp. They're going to rip that whole thing down around Flat Road and build I call it a mini Uptown Worthington. It'll be Uptown Worthington. So, because it's going to be more uppity, if you can get more uppity when they're done. But again, I wouldn't count on it because you remember if those that were around in 2008, Brian O'Neill came to our meeting, said, oh, you'd have this would all be built, that Uptown Worthington be built out by 2012. You're going to have $7 million in real estate taxes coming in, and we have Target, Wegmans, you know, now we got a couple other little ones over there, and the apartment complex, but we're not even at half of that. We're about a third of it. Yeah, he did come in a snow day to meet with us. It was him and his entourage. He has a driver. He does. So this is the budget gap. If you look at the budget there, the shortfall, the gap between the expenses and revenue, while it grows, it doesn't grow too dramatically as it was in the past. I will say the budget gap there, that's the blue, that's the difference between expenses and revenues.
Hey, Chuck, quick question too. How are you accounting for those revenue increases? Is that increase in fair market value, new home starts, new buildings? Like how?
It's a trend based on what we've seen in the short term over the past 3 to 5 years, because we have had an uptick and pulling people back into online. We still have a pretty good list of reverse appeals, although the lower hanging fruit, so to speak, has been all taken care of, and we've gotten them back to where they should be. We do have quite a few on our upcoming list to deal with for. Pension increase is built into there, so it's factored into the, so the pension increase is in there. Have a modest increase for other benefits, because if you look at the long-term trend of other benefits, it's really closer to 6 or 8%, even though we've had a bad couple years. So, you know, not to scare everybody and put 22.5% as our trend, that would be, you know, you got to look back over, we have a pretty good history of closing in on, you know, 8 or 9 years of this, so. Again, like the second line says, all figures are approximate. So that's that. And then this is a 5-year budget, which kind of assumes, this would assume that the board, and I'm not saying you're doing this, so I don't want anybody to say that, oh, the board's going to just do this. You're not. This is just for a purpose of this. This assumes that the Act 1 increase is levied every year. Just, and we use 2.5% as the Act 1 increase. So you can see, if you look at line 1, which is expenses, and then line 5, which is the revenue after, it shouldn't say 0% tax increase, should say Act 1. But if you look at that, by 21, 22, you actually have closed the gap in that. Now, what does that mean? That means in prior years, probably from using reserves and, or you may or may not need to go up to the index some of those years, whatever. But if you continued to do the index for the next 5 years, and everything stayed the same, you know, and you had an average, you'd be 2 million over. So you would be able to ratchet that back if you wanted. And then the next slide shows the gap actually kind of goes away there in 2021. You can see the blue line diving into the red line. Again, the budget calendar, you will have to adopt a preliminary budget on the 16th. I would say that if you want any more information, if you could let me know this week for next week. I will be here on the 16th, but my niece is getting married in California the weekend before that, so I will not be here much after the 9th. So, you know, I can have anything you want ready for Monday, but any changes Monday, if you give me something for Monday night, I can try, but we'll see. And the final budget will be, you know, again, the preliminary budget is just that, a preliminary budget, so. Any questions? Again, there's a bunch of attachments you have there. You know, it's kind of the expenses and revenues sorted kind of a lot of different ways. There's some function summary changes. There's some the reserve history, which a lot of these things are in our CAFRA or our budget book that we do. So it's just updated for this year's numbers. Again, I said there was if you get down to the very last one, the bottom of the capital project 5-year budget, it's really a 10-year budget. We have a kind of a wild ass guess for years 6 to 10, because there are some big things. I mean, we are, you know, next year will be the 19th year the middle school opens. So you're closing in on a time where you're not too far away from having to roof the middle school because it's a 20-year roof, 25 hopefully. But there's a lot of maintenance coming. And again, if you look at that 5-year budget, the 1920 budget on there is 4.3 million. And that's pushing some things back. And we have a major concrete issue at the middle school. I mean, if you've been to the middle school, it is major. It is $1 million concrete issue.
Sandbox.
Huh?
It's like a sandbox.
It's embarrassing for me. I mean, I just would love to fix that, and we've tried many ways of trying to fix it, and it just looks like it looks worse than a patch. So we would love to have done that this year. We actually had recommended to the facilities this year, but we just don't have, you know, with that big roof coming. We have a couple roofs next year, which we were pushed back. You know, Charlestown's, I think it's Charlestown. Is Charlestown? Yeah, Charlestown's shingle roof over the old building, and which is, you know, $500,000. Oh, the Katie Markley heat pumps. I mean, you can look down there and see. And again, we'll be talking about those a little more at next Tuesday night at the facilities committee meeting. But really, this year's 3 big issues that we have, and it exceeds, you know, the 3 of those are $3.7 million. Is the fire panel at the middle school, which has to be rewired, the water main, which is down the back driveway of the bus of the high school, which we are just kind of fingers crossed, toes crossed that it doesn't rupture before then, because it's and we have to move it because we're not going to send the water main down over we can't send it down over the creek the way it comes in because of the bridge. We'd have to replace the bridge, which would, I don't know what would be a 7-figure process then. So, I mean, the buildings are old. They're getting old. I shouldn't say they're old. We have great buildings. I mean, our buildings look good because our guys keep them very good. When you walk in, they look great. I mean, this building looks great. This is the only building that was never renovated, other than whatever we could do here and there.
Also, we had talked about, the one other question that we received was about the one-to-one and the benefit of the one-to-one as well as the reminder of the timeline. So that's also there under presentations. It's the second one. And Dr. O'Toole provided the implementation timeline, with the new timeline having fourth grade start in 1920. So next year, 18-19, our grade levels of 5th, 6th, 7th, 9th, 10th, and 11th would have the one-to-one. Then the distribution process and the professional development is outlined there. The largest benefit of the one-to-one initiative has less to do with the device and more to do with the learning management system, which is that the curriculum is embedded into Canvas or into the learning management system. So it integrates the technology with all of the subjects. It accesses it in real time. It provides the digital collaboration with students and the teachers and the consistency of resources so that if you're taking Algebra 1, everyone taking Algebra 1, independent of who the teacher is, receives the same, the expectations of outcomes are the same, and that's across. The goal is to shift the instructional practices and resources to increase collaboration, rigor, and engagement, and a number of apps. Dr. O'Toole and his team started a group of students. So the students will actually be providing on-site tech support through a club at the high school. And they have been invited and accepted that invitation happily to come to the Instructional Technology Committee meeting next Tuesday. And they will be presenting some of their highlights as far as using the devices and the learning management system. So if you want a really hot time next Tuesday night, come to the Instructional Technology Committee meeting, and you'll see some of the implementation of the learning management system in
And
action.
I think the biggest plus from my end, which really has not a lot to do with student achievement and student use, is just that we are consolidating our technology. If you recall, 3 or 4 years ago, we have computer labs, we have labs on carts, we have here and there. You know, when we're done this, everybody will have a common technology. There will still be some labs because we still have art and things like that that have specialized things. But all the hodgepodge, I call like almost like a patchwork quilt of technology. And really this will hopefully focus our support of the technology too down to, instead of supporting 6 different generations of Dell and whatever laptops we've got or computers down. So cost-wise, if you remember the numbers and I'm vaguely remembering the spreadsheets, just the savings or just the comparison of replacing computer labs and replacing student computers in the carts and stuff like that it was the same price or close. I shouldn't say same. I'm going to pull those numbers out though.
So when we initially looked at this, I remember, Dr. O'Toole did a very good presentation identifying costs and how we were offsetting things with regard to spending money on technology we didn't need because we were going in this direction. I think I was the one that asked the question. I don't see the numbers here. I just want to get a general sense as to, whether or not we're staying kind of within budget with regard to what was projected, from what has occurred to date and as we look into the future. And I guess we can talk about this next meeting because I don't see the numbers here. But on balance, I can see the benefit of this. I think it's important. I just wanted to bring this item to the forefront so we could talk about it in this meeting. I know we talk about one-to-one. The presentations tend to be, very detailed. I was just trying to get more of a business metric associated with it, just make sure we're on track with what was projected. I understand we've shifted implementation. It looks like final rollout is scheduled for 21, 22. But again, I just want to ensure that we're on track and on budget, if not under. And I know that, Steph did raise a very good point, which is the tools are changing. The tools from the vendors we're purchasing from are getting better, maybe cheaper, and whether or not that's going to impact current or future costs. So maybe we can bring those numbers up at the next business meeting. I kind of appreciate seeing this.
Yeah, I had tried to get to those today, but
That's fine, yeah, just, I think just for the benefit.
I'll have them for next week. I'm actually looking at some of the numbers from 2015 when you talked about them.
And the leveling of the curriculum is very important. I know, Regina, that was one of the issues we talked about early on. It's been an issue that's been on the tongue of many board members here. And I think that's a very important thing to ensure that all students are getting the same level of education from class to class across all subjects. So I think that's a very important point with regard to the program itself. Thank you.
So I would encourage you to look at all those documents online. If you want, I could have a quiz next week. If you don't, you could tell me if you want to see anything else.
Yeah, so
and
like
I'm
you said,
gonna-
just make sure that. If anybody's got any questions, just email them to you. So you can answer them next week at the meeting when they get asked again, right?
Correct.
Right.
And I'll apologize in advance if we're a little sluggish getting things up because my secretary broke her back and will be out 4 to 6 weeks. That's why she's not sitting across from me here. So,
Yeah, one of the other issues too, I know that I had asked for the information, and maybe it's in here, I just don't see it, but I would like to see just an explanation of the existing contract we have with the teachers. I know it's somewhat historic, but we had projected costs, we have actual costs. I think we just need to understand, particularly as a board, where the deviations arise from. Some of them, obviously you can easily explain them based on the fact we had to hire more people because of additional students. But I would just like to see that because, we are in contract negotiations, and I think we as a board need to see at least how we got here from the standpoint of what the baseline is for the contract when we're looking at these numbers, appreciating costs, because it's a big number. We had projections, and I'd just like to see where we are with regard to the contract, the actual spend, including, the breakout for prescription, healthcare and all the other benefits, and you can kind of break those out as a line item, because I think we need to see it. We've talked around the issues, but I like to see if it can be a single slide that holistically shows the cost all in, and then you can break it out based on the actual spend. I know you'll have to project that to the end of the year, but I think, again, it's important for this board to understand that under the contract, certain costs are fixed, some are not. Prescription healthcare seems to be wildly out of control, and I think that's, as we consider these types of issues, understanding what those terms of a contract are and how they impact the budget. So hopefully that will make the meeting next week.
we're working on that. And, your examples are right, Bill. I mean, 2.5 years ago, we had a projection from our consultants of a almost zero increase in healthcare based on what our trend was there. And in 16, 17, we had a 22.5% increase. 2.5 years ago, it talked about the retirement rates change. They change every year. There was a trend not too long ago where the change was the governor would drive the rate down because he wanted to see the state budget would free up some money in the state budget. But the last couple years the rate has been driven up with the actuaries. And I think the reason for that is the politicians are now listening to the actuaries, because when they didn't, it got them in trouble and cost them down the road. Because if you don't use what the actuary tells you, instead you say if the actuary says it's 10%, but they only want to pay 5%, most of the time the actuaries are pretty close, and so then there's a makeup there. So I know you all want to get to the final 4.
It looks like we've covered everything in the finance and budget discussion items. Do the board members have any other questions about the finance or budget issues? Anything that's arisen? I guess seeing no questions, our next finance committee meeting is scheduled for May 7th, 2018. Are there any other items that anybody wants to talk about this evening that are outside the confines of finance and budget?
Just to go on record, Samantha had to leave early because her son is achieving Eagle Scout. So
that is true.
she
Thank
did
you.
meant no disrespect by leaving. She was not upset, but she just,
I thought Dave said something. I'm sorry.
there'll be the bright and early hour of 7:30 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. We have a policy committee meeting. I'll be there.
Thank you. Seeing no other issues, questions, or comments, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.